Imagine you're walking through Boston on a cold January afternoon. It's 1919. The First World War has just ended. People are going back to work, kids are outside, horses are pulling carts through narrow streets, and honestly, for once, nothing particularly dramatic is happening. And then you hear a sound that witnesses later compare to machine gun fire. Metal starts screaming. People turn around, and coming down the street is a wall of molasses. Not water, not mud, molasses. A dark, sticky wave moving fast enough that some people have absolutely no chance of outrunning it. Now, when I first came across this story years ago, I thought exactly what you're probably thinking right now. This sounds ridiculous. A molasses flood. That's the sort of sentence somebody says at a bar after 3 drinks, and then insists their grandfather told them it happened. But no, it happened. People died, buildings were destroyed, horses had to be put down because they were trapped so badly that rescuers couldn't free them. And once you look past how bizarre the story sounds, it becomes much less funny. Because the Great Molasses Flood is really a story about what happens when a company is in a hurry, people ignore warning signs, and everyone assumes that something massive and dangerous is probably safe because, well, it hasn't exploded yet. And that last part bothers me, because history is full of disasters where the warning signs were there the entire time. People saw them, people talked about them, and somehow everybody kept going. So let's talk about January 15th, 1919. The day Boston learned that even something as harmless-looking as molasses can become terrifying when you put more than 2 million gallons of it inside a badly designed steel tank. To understand why Boston had an enormous tank full of molasses in the first place, we need to talk about what molasses actually meant economically at the time. Today, most of us think of molasses as something sitting on a supermarket shelf that maybe somebody's grandmother uses for baking. In the early 20th century, it was much more important than that. Molasses could be fermented to produce industrial alcohol, and alcohol had all kinds of commercial uses. It could be used in manufacturing, chemicals, and of course, alcoholic beverages. So companies moved huge quantities of this stuff. And one of those companies was the Purity Distilling Company, which was connected to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. In 1915, they needed a large storage tank in Boston's North End, near the harbor and railway lines. From a business perspective, the location made sense. Ships could bring molasses into the harbor. It could be pumped into the tank and later transported to a processing facility. Efficient, convenient, profitable. The problem was the tank itself. It was enormous, around 50 feet high and about 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding more than 2 million gallons. Just stop for a second and imagine standing next to that thing. A steel cylinder, roughly 5 stories tall, filled almost to the top with thick liquid weighing thousands upon thousands of tons. I work in IT, and there's a particular type of sentence that makes me nervous whenever I hear it. We don't have time to test it properly. We'll fix the problems later. Because that's not really a technical strategy. That's gambling. And from what we know about this tank, gambling is a pretty good description of what happened. The construction was rushed. The tank was put into service without the kind of thorough testing you'd really like to see when you're about to fill a giant steel container with millions of gallons of heavy liquid. One of the most disturbing details is that, during construction, water was reportedly added only to a relatively shallow depth, rather than filling the tank completely for a proper full-load test. Now, I'm not an engineer, and I don't pretend to be one. But even as a historian looking at this, there's an obvious question. If you're building a tank designed to hold more than 2 million gallons, wouldn't you want to know what happens when it is actually holding more than 2 million gallons? Apparently, we'll find out in production existed long before software development. And then the tank started leaking. Not once. Not in some tiny, invisible way that only an expert could notice. Local residents could apparently see molasses seeping from the seams. Children were said to collect the leaking molasses in containers. Think about how insane that is in hindsight. A giant industrial tank is visibly leaking its contents. Neighborhood children are treating the leak like free candy, and life just continues. Now, to be fair, a leak doesn't automatically mean catastrophic failure. Industrial equipment can leak without collapsing, but it was one warning among several. People living nearby also reported noises from the tank. Groaning, rumbling, metallic sounds. And again, I always try not to judge people from the past as though we're somehow smarter than they were. We're not. Give modern society enough time and we'll ignore a giant warning sign too. Probably because an app told us everything was fine. But there is something deeply unsettling about imagining this enormous tank looming over a residential neighborhood, making strange noises and leaking from its sides, while everyone gradually gets used to it. That's one of the strangest things about danger. Human beings are very good at normalizing things. The first time your building shakes, you panic. The 20th time, you say, "Yeah, it does that." Until one day it does something different. Company officials knew about the leaks. The response, at least in part, was not to rebuild the tank. Instead, the exterior was reportedly painted brown, making the dark molasses leaking down its sides less noticeable. And when I first read that, I had to stop, because that is one of those details that feels too perfectly symbolic to be real. You have a structural problem. Your tank is leaking. What's the solution? Fix the tank? No. Paint it the color of the leak. It's almost impressive in the worst possible way. Now, there were practical efforts to address some leaks, but the larger structural issues remained. And here's where things become especially important. Modern investigations have suggested that the tank's steel was too thin and that its riveted construction had serious weaknesses. Researchers studying the disaster much later found that the steel itself may have been brittle by modern standards, particularly in cold conditions. In other words, this wasn't one bolt coming loose on a perfectly designed structure. The tank had fundamental problems. But in January 1919, the people walking past it didn't know that. They just knew there was a giant tank, and the giant tank had been standing there for years. And if something has existed for years without killing you, your brain starts filing it under probably safe. On January 12th or 13th, a ship delivered a massive load of molasses to the tank. The molasses arriving from the ship was warmer than the cold molasses already inside. That matters because fermentation can produce carbon dioxide gas, and changing temperatures can create pressure changes inside a sealed or partially sealed structure. Then came January 15th. The weather in Boston had changed rapidly. After several very cold days, temperatures rose significantly. The exact role of temperature and fermentation in triggering the failure has been debated, but we do know the tank was heavily loaded and already structurally weak. At around 12:40 in the afternoon, people nearby heard something. Some described a low rumbling, others heard loud metallic noises. And then the tank came apart. Imagine a steel wall dozens of feet high suddenly splitting, the rivets tearing loose, metal plates bursting outward, and behind them more than 2 million gallons of molasses. The wave that followed has often been estimated at up to 25 feet high in some places. It rushed through the north end at roughly 35 miles per hour at its fastest. 35 miles per hour. Let that sink in, because when I say molasses, your brain probably pictures something slowly dripping from a spoon. And that's exactly why this story sounds funny until you think about the physics. Millions of gallons of anything, suddenly released from a tall tank, have enormous energy. This wasn't a puddle. It was a moving wall of mass. A wave of molasses tore through buildings, snapped supports, crushed structures, and swept people away. The nearby elevated railway was damaged. A freight house was smashed. Buildings were knocked from foundations. Horses were caught in the flood. People were hit by debris carried inside the wave, and the first few seconds must have been complete confusion. Because how do you even understand what's happening? If you see water coming, your brain recognizes a flood. If you see flames, you recognize a fire. But imagine turning a corner and seeing a brown wall moving toward you through a city street. You probably don't even process what it is until it's already there. 21 people were killed, and around 150 were injured. The victims included workers, residents, children. One of the youngest was a 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Iantosca, who was reportedly crushed by a railway freight car pushed by the flood. Another victim, firefighter George Leahy, drowned after being trapped in a damaged firehouse. And there is something horrible about that word, drowned, in molasses. I don't say that for shock value. I say it because it forces you to understand what rescuers were dealing with. This wasn't just liquid flowing away. Molasses is viscous, sticky, heavy, and January in Boston is cold. As the molasses cooled, it became thicker. Rescue workers trying to move through it found themselves struggling. Horses trapped in the substance panicked and exhausted themselves. Some had to be shot because freeing them was impossible. People trying to rescue survivors had molasses sticking to their clothing, their hands, their equipment. Everything became harder. And here's something I find particularly disturbing. Once the initial wave passed, the danger didn't simply disappear. People could become pinned beneath debris and coated in thick molasses, unable to pull themselves free. In a normal flood, water eventually drains. Molasses slowly spreads and settles, and as it cools, it becomes more difficult to move through. Rescuers spent days searching the wreckage. Some bodies were not recovered immediately. The cleanup took weeks, and the molasses spread far beyond the immediate disaster zone. Workers used salt water from the harbor and sand to try to remove it. The sticky substance got onto boots, clothing, tools, vehicles. People carried it across the city. Streets and public transportation reportedly remained sticky for some time afterward. There's even a long-standing Boston legend that on hot summer days, you can still smell molasses in parts of the North End. Is that literally true today? Probably not in any reliable scientific sense, but it's exactly the kind of story cities hold on to after something traumatic happens. A physical disaster becomes a memory, then the memory becomes folklore. But while Boston was cleaning its streets, another fight was beginning. Because the company responsible for the tank had a problem. 21 people were dead, dozens were injured, homes and businesses had been destroyed, and the tank had very obviously failed. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company argued that the tank may have been sabotaged. And before we laugh at that, remember the political atmosphere of 1919. The United States was experiencing intense fear of anarchist violence. There had been bombings and political unrest, so claiming sabotage wasn't completely absurd in the context of the time, but it was also extremely convenient. Because if a terrorist blew up your tank, that's very different from admitting your tank was badly built. Families of victims and property owners sued. What followed became one of the most significant civil cases of its era. Hundreds of claims were combined, and the legal proceedings dragged on for years. The court appointed an auditor, Hugh W. Ogden, to examine evidence. Engineers testified. Experts analyzed the tank's design and construction. Witnesses described the leaks and noises. And gradually, the sabotage argument became less convincing. In 1925, Ogden concluded that the tank had failed because of structural weakness, not because of an explosion caused by outsiders. The company was held responsible and paid settlements to victims and their families. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one weird disaster in Boston, because the Great Molasses Flood happened during a period when large industrial structures were often built with less government oversight than we would expect today. After the disaster, engineering and construction practices faced greater scrutiny. Requirements involving design review, permits, inspections, and engineering accountability became more important in Boston and elsewhere. And I think this is one of those historical lessons people misunderstand. Regulations usually don't appear because some bored bureaucrat woke up one morning and decided paperwork would be fun. A surprising number of safety rules exist because people died before those rules existed. Building codes are written in the shadow of collapsed buildings. Fire regulations are written after fires. Aviation procedures are rewritten after crashes. Industrial standards improve after factories explode. We inherit the lessons, but we forget the bodies that paid for them. And then, 20 or 30 years later, somebody looks at the regulation and says, "Why do we even need this?" History usually has an answer. Now, something else fascinates me about the molasses flood. The disaster sounds almost comedic when reduced to one sentence. Boston was flooded with molasses. You can imagine it as a cartoon. People slipping around, horses covered in syrup. It's such a strange image that it's easy to forget that real families lost people that day. And that's a problem historians run into constantly. Time turns tragedy into trivia. The further we move from an event, the easier it becomes to summarize it as an amusing fact. 21 people died, but 100 years later, the story is often introduced as, "Did you know Boston once had a molasses flood?" And yes, that's a great hook. I just used it myself. But the hook is the doorway, not the story. The actual story is about negligence. It's about engineering. It's about economics. It's about people living beside something dangerous because it became part of their daily landscape. And it's about a company that apparently had reasons to suspect the tank wasn't behaving properly, but kept using it. That's what gets me. Because everybody loves stories where disaster arrives with no warning. They're almost comforting. A lightning strike, a sudden earthquake, nothing anybody could have done. The molasses flood isn't comforting. The tank leaked. Residents noticed. People heard noises. The construction had been rushed. Problems were there before January 15th. Maybe nobody could predict the exact minute or exact form of failure, but this wasn't a perfectly healthy tank spontaneously exploding. There were warnings, and maybe that's why this story still feels modern. We live surrounded by systems most of us don't understand. Bridges, servers, power grids, financial systems, aircraft, dams, supply chains. We assume somebody tested them, somebody inspected them, somebody knows what they're doing. Most of the time, that's true, but sometimes everybody assumes somebody else checked. And that is one of the most dangerous sentences in civilization. I thought somebody else checked. As someone who works around technology, that hits especially hard for me. In software, a bad assumption crashes an application, usually annoying, occasionally expensive. In engineering, a bad assumption can put millions of gallons of molasses above a neighborhood. And there's another lesson here. Disasters don't care whether the substance involved sounds dangerous. Gasoline? Sure, we're cautious. Explosives? Obviously. Molasses? Who's afraid of molasses? But danger isn't about whether something has a scary name. It's about energy, mass, pressure, speed, and context. A pillow is harmless until you drop 10,000 of them from an airplane. Water keeps you alive until there are millions of tons of it behind a failing dam. And molasses belongs on pancakes until you store 2 million gallons of it 50 feet above street level in a questionable steel tank. Context matters. Today, the tank is gone. The area has changed enormously. Boston's North End is dense, historic, alive. If you walk through it now, you could easily pass near the site without realizing what happened there. A small plaque commemorates the disaster. That's it. No giant ruin, no preserved tank, no enormous memorial. Just a city continuing to exist on top of its own history, which cities are very good at doing. And honestly, I like that in a strange way. History isn't always hidden in castles and battlefields. Sometimes you're walking to a restaurant and, 100 years earlier, people were fighting for their lives on the exact same street because a giant steel tank exploded. The world is layered like that. Your ordinary place was somebody else's extraordinary day. So, was the Great Molasses Flood one of history's largest disasters? No. It didn't change the course of a war. It didn't collapse an empire. 21 deaths, tragic as they were, are small compared with many industrial catastrophes. But history doesn't have to be enormous to be important. Sometimes a smaller event gives you an almost perfect example of a much larger human problem. We build something. It shows signs of trouble. Fixing it properly costs time and money. Nothing terrible has happened yet, so we keep using it. Then one day, the difference between "it's been fine so far" and "it's failing right now" becomes about 10 seconds. And by then, nobody cares how much money you saved. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. Not the fact that molasses can move at 35 miles per hour. Although, to be completely honest, I'm never going to look at a jar of molasses the same way again. It's the tank. The leaking, groaning tank standing above a neighborhood for years. Because imagine being one of the people who walked past it every morning. Maybe you noticed the brown streaks. Maybe you heard it making noises. Maybe somebody told you it had always done that. And eventually you stopped thinking about it. Then, on January 15th, 1919, that background object you had seen 1,000 times suddenly became the most important thing in your life. That's terrifying to me. Not because it's unusual, because it's familiar. Human beings adapt incredibly well. Sometimes too well. We can get used to almost anything, including warning signs. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Great Molasses Flood. The dangerous moment isn't always when something starts going wrong. Sometimes the dangerous moment is when everybody gets used to the fact that it's going wrong. So the next time somebody tells you a safety rule is unnecessary because nothing bad has happened before. Remember Boston. Remember the giant tank. Remember the children collecting molasses from its leaks. And remember that for several years, technically, nothing bad had happened. Until one Wednesday afternoon, more than 2 million gallons came through the streets.